Resident Evil 2 was developed by Capcom and published by Capcom. And let me start out by saying that I've played a lot of games this console generation, and I mean a lot. I have over 80 PlayStation 4 games and a few Xbox One titles as well. And hands down, this is one of the absolute best video games that I've played since I bought my PS4 on launch day a few years ago. Capcom has really been impressive as of late. This is a company that used to be grouped in the same party as companies like EA and Activision. But Capcom has really turned themselves around over the past 2 years, really starting with Resident Evil 7. When I played Resident Evil 7, I wasn't expecting that game to turn out as well as it did, and that ended up in my top 3 favorite video games of the 8th generation. And this game is right up there with it. This game is Resident Evil in spades. And the main reason for that is because the game pays homage to classic survival horror gameplay, where the game isn't a shooting gallery. It really is about conserving your ammunition and only using it when necessary, especially if you're playing on the hardest difficulty, which I'm going to speak more about that later, because that's something that Capcom does very well that most video game developers just fuck up instantly, is the difficulty. But before I get into that, I want to talk about how this game really pays attention to detail. So this game is a remake of the original Resident Evil 2, which came out back in 1998. And I have the original Resident Evil 2 digitally downloaded on my PlayStation 3. So if I ever want to play it, I can just boot up my PlayStation 3 and play the original. I tried playing the original Resident Evil 2 either 2 or 3 years ago, and I didn't make it too far into the game. I made it somewhere within the police station before just giving up. And the main reason I gave up is because the controls were awful. In fact, the original Resident Evil 2 is probably the worst video game I've ever played when it comes to how the game plays. The controls were awful, like the way you moved, and then also the way you shoot at enemies in that game. The mechanics of it is just poorly designed. And so when Capcom announced they were doing a remake to Resident Evil 2, I was thrilled immediately. I was excited. I knew the game was going to be good because I knew they weren't just going to do a classic, focused camera angles style of gameplay like the original Resident Evil games. I knew they weren't going to go that direction with it. I knew it was going to be more in tune with what they did with Resident Evil 4. And that's what I wanted this game to be. That's what this game needed to be. If you're going to remake something, you can't just remake it exactly the same as the original game, because not only do I already have the original game, but the original game has problems. It has issues. So you have to update things. You have to modernize it. And that's what Capcom has done with this title. The controls for this feel perfect for a survival horror game. This is actually the best Resident Evil game I've played when it comes to the controls. Because even when you go back and you play Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6, the mechanics of those games in terms of the movement feels stiff. And this game doesn't feel stiff. Whether you're playing as Leon or Claire or someone else, you can easily spin the character around without having to turn the camera. You can run backward without having to turn the camera. Like, you can run towards the camera. And whenever you're aiming at enemies, the game will automatically turn the camera to whatever you're facing. And it just feels great to play this game. And they made it so you can move while you're aiming, which they did that for Resident Evil 6, but the shooting in Resident Evil 6 was dog shit. The shooting in this game feels pretty good. And mechanically it is a bit strange, but it doesn't take a lot to get used to it. So I'm glad that they updated the game in that regard. But the game also pays homage to the original Resident Evil 2. The environments look like they were plucked straight from the original game, just updated with modern graphics on a 1-to-1 scale. And I'm glad that they did that. There's a lot of little things within the level design that I can see that they took from the original game, and so I can appreciate the game on that level. This game also pays homage to the original Resident Evil gameplay design, which is what Resident Evil 7 did, which is why that game was great. And it's also the reason why this game is great as well. If you play Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6, those games are really action-based video games set in a survival horror setting. But outside of that, there's not much in terms of level design in those games. They are very straightforward, easy to play games. And the only thing you really have to manage is your inventory. But not like how you manage your inventory in the older Resident Evil games. In this game, you explore through these various locations. You're supposed to pick up key items, which is the only way to make progress in the game's story. But then there are other items that you can obtain by unlocking certain objects in the environment, such as the safes or the weapons locker at the beginning of the game. That's great level design because, one, it adds layers to the level design in the game, and it forces the player to pay attention to their environment and what they have in their inventory, far more than most video games that are out there. And that's part of what is great about survival horror. You know, Resident Evil made that type of thing popular, and it's great to see that style of gameplay, that style of game design return in this game. And another thing I love about this game is the fact that it's not a very long game at all. It's actually pretty short, and if you know exactly how to get through the game, you can clear this game within 2 hours, or a little over 2 hours, depending on how fast you are. My shortest playthrough so far has been 2 hours and 21 minutes, and I did that with Claire on standard. And I've already played through this game 4 times. I first played it with Leon on hardcore, beat that, and then I played it with Claire on the second story, and I cleared that on hardcore, and then I went back through and played the game again with Leon and Claire on standard, doing speed runs for both. And I'm just not tired of this game at all, even though I've played through it 4 times already. And that's the hallmark of a good game right there, when I want to go back and replay it, because I feel that there's more to do. And there's actually quite a bit to do in this game. If you go back and you try and complete the game as quickly as possible on standard for the first and the second story runs that they have in the game, on both standard and hardcore. And speaking of hardcore, which I mentioned earlier, Capcom really knows how to do difficulty in their games. These Resident Evil games actually are the perfect example of a hard difficulty mode done right. I remember when I bought God of War, the newest God of War used, last year. And I first tried to play that game on its hardest difficulty. And I already didn't like that game. But trying to play it on its hardest difficulty made me dislike it even more, because it wasn't properly designed. All the enemies were just damage sponges that took forever to kill. And hardcore mode, Resident Evil 2 isn't really designed that way. You do have a fighting chance to take on pretty much any enemy that's in the game. The most difficult challenge really comes from the sewer monsters that are in the game. I'm not sure what those creatures are called, but I quickly figured out a way to run past those enemies and to evade them entirely. And I love it when game developers design games to do that, where you don't have to fight if you don't want to fight. Sometimes it's best to just avoid fighting entirely. And a lot of the other Resident Evil games are designed that way. And so it's great to see that come back for this. Also, the game, when it comes to the graphics, is top-notch. Capcom didn't half-ass this at all. When they said remake, they meant remake, not a remaster. They put some money behind this production, and it really shows. You know, there's a lot of detail in the environment. There's detail with the weather effects, like when you're outside and it's raining. There's detail on the character models. The farther you go in the game, you can clearly see damage on either Claire or Leon, depending on who you're playing. And there's detail on the enemy AI as well. There's detail in the environment. So graphically, the game is up there with some of your best selling games that are in the AAA space. And that's something I really appreciated about this game. Because if you compare this game to the original Resident Evil 2, the original looks terrible. It's an awful looking game, even by late 1990s standards. So that just made it easier for me to digest this game and to appreciate it more, is because Capcom put the time into making the game look good. And the soundtrack suits the game well, to the degree where it feels appropriate and it really blends in with whatever is happening on screen. And usually there is no music until you're engaged in combat with an enemy, and that just works for survival horror. So I was really able to appreciate the soundtrack. And because I bought the deluxe edition for the game, I can use the original game's soundtrack while I'm playing this new version. And I have yet to do that, but I intend to do that on my next playthrough and see how it works. Now, there's not much that I can say that's bad about Resident Evil 2, but there is one major thing that I just absolutely, not necessarily hate, but I am just annoyed every time this particular enemy comes on screen, and that's Tyrant. At first, when I encountered Tyrant in my first playthrough, I was like, okay, this is pretty frightening. You know, he's this big hulking creature that just follows you around and chases you everywhere you go. And he's pretty menacing when he comes on screen, or even when he's not on screen, because you can hear his footsteps and they're very distinct. And when he is in the same room with you, you'll hear that ominous music playing. And it's effective at first. However, as the game drags on, Tyrant really becomes an annoyance. And in my later subsequent playthroughs, I found myself trying to avoid even dealing with him entirely. Like, I didn't even want to encounter him. Not because he was frightening, but because he was just annoying. For example, one time I was in the library and I was trying to move the bookshelves, the bookcases, so I can run across the top and make it to the courtyard, because that's the only way you can do it in the game. That's how they developed it. If Tyrant enters the room while you're trying to do that puzzle, you have to continuously go up the ladder and then run all the way around, run back downstairs, and move the bookcases again. Because if he catches up with you, he's going to do damage. And if you're playing on a harder difficulty, you can die pretty quickly. And so Tyrant could have been handled a lot better than what they did with him. And easily I find him to be the worst part of the game. And I would add the lickers to my list of things that's bad about the Resident Evil 2 remake, if it wasn't for the fact that technically you're not supposed to actually fight the lickers. You're supposed to walk around them. And if you're playing as Claire, Claire has the grenade launcher, and that can kill the lickers in one hit if you're playing on hardcore. So the lickers aren't really an issue. The only enemy in the game that's really an issue is Tyrant. I think they could have handled him a lot better than what they did. But seeing as how the game has turned out overall, it's not really a big issue. The only other thing that I didn't really care for about this game is the Ada Wong cameo in Leon's campaign, because Ada Wong isn't given any healing items, so when you're playing as her, if you take damage, it's permanent. And then they even put a trophy in the game where you're not supposed to engage the enemies in combat, and you're just supposed to use the little gadget that they gave her to make it through her portion of the game, her small portion, without dying. And I was able to do that barely. But yeah, I didn't really enjoy that part of the game, although that's a very small part of the game. And the boss fights. The boss fights were actually kind of disappointing in this game. The crocodile in particular, I don't know how it was in the original game, but in this new version, it's a very short scripted sequence that lasts about a minute, and then you just blow up the crocodile and it dies instantly. And I was kind of disappointed about that. And fighting the William Birkin boss in the various stages of the G-Virus, I didn't really care for that. And the only time I really found fighting that boss fun was the very first time you encounter him, because he'll swing that pipe that he carries around, and that'll create steam in the area, and that'll stun him and give you the chance to do damage, or give you the chance to regroup and go collect some ammunition or healing items in the environment. And the other times that you fight him, I just didn't feel like those battles were designed properly. So I didn't really care for the bosses that they have in the game, but there's not too many of them. And so overall, this was a great reimagining. Resident Evil 2 is actually the perfect example of remaking a classic game and it not having to be exactly like the original to be great. And I really hope that Square Enix is taking notes from Capcom in regards to the Final Fantasy VII remake in that regard. So that's what I got to say about the Resident Evil 2 remake. It's a fantastic game. In terms of whether this game is better than Resident Evil 7 or whether Resident Evil 7 is better than Resident Evil 2 really depends on the type of fan you are of Resident Evil. To be honest, I like both games equally, although I like Resident Evil 7 slightly more because that game did breathe some new life into the franchise, and this is just a remake of an older classic game. So that's just my opinion on that. But anyway, that's my retrospective for the Resident Evil 2 remake. The next game on my list is Kingdom Hearts 3, which is arriving in the mail tomorrow on release day as I'm recording this. So I'm looking forward to playing that and making a retrospective for that.